Hi everyone, welcome. Well, I took a peek in here a moment ago and I'm not sure if we're going to get the same effect as before. But yeah, I don't know if it's visible on the camera, but what we've been monitoring over the past few check-ins does seem to have degraded to an even worse situation than we've seen previously. In case you're not seeing it, the situation that I'm referring to is the presence of all these little flying insects everywhere. When I first opened the container a moment ago, just to try to position the camera, I was definitely greeted by a fairly large swarm of flying insects coming at me, and I just covered up the lid really quick and figured I would try to leave some of them in there to give you guys a sense of what's going on here. At the moment, it does seem like this might be the only system in which I'm seeing the outbreak of flying insects. And I'm going to do what I always do when I start seeing the flying insects. I'm going to bring out my BTI solution and squirt the top surface with the assumption that the critters that I'm trying to treat with this stuff are pretty much on the surface. I have a feeling that the flying insects don't really burrow down, but I really hope that this doesn't end up becoming some sort of a plague. But before we do anything else, I just wanted to get that stuff in there, and I guess at the end maybe we'll treat the system with even more, just to make sure there's a sufficient amount of that stuff in here to hopefully be effective. So the worms that live over here are red wigglers in the VermiBag Mini. I've got a little bit of info about these little guys to share with you before we get into it. This system has now been fed 23 times, and that last check-in 13 days ago was also observing some flying insects, and I think even the time before, maybe one or two times before, and it does seem like the matter has been kind of getting a little bit worse. I really hope it remains contained to this system, and I really hope that the Mosquito Dunks solution does its job. So now the plastic covering on this system does seem to be keeping the moisture level in the middle pretty comfortable for the worms. Around the edges I'm sensing a little bit of dryness, which is typical since the surface of the bag does tend to allow moisture to permeate through and get lost to evaporation. And I've got a funny feeling now that the summer months are here and that my furnace is running less. My furnace, I believe, is one of the key contributors to dryness, or at least dry air, in the house. But once the furnace stops running, the humidity in the house will start to match what's going on outside, at least to a certain point. And then the increased humidity in the air around here will result in systems having a far less tendency to get dry and lose their moisture to evaporation. So we've been positioning the feedings in this system down the center, and we're going to continue doing that. I just figured I would do a quick lap around the outer edge, because around the outer edge is where we do sometimes observe a little bit of dryness in the material. And in the past, we've come in here with my squirt bottle, not so much to apply the Mosquito Dunks solution, but to actually moisten the dry materials that are around the edges. But I am starting to get that feeling like it's not going to be necessary to do that, at least on this occasion. And quite likely not going to be necessary in future check-ins either, so that's kind of nice. I was sort of anticipating that, but it is kind of nice when you finally get to that point where you feel like you're not going to have to manage the moisture level in the system. especially now that you got another headache to consider, which is managing the flying insects. So now down within the feeding zone of this system, we've got numerous fairly large slow composting objects, such as this stem of a pumpkin and a number of other little odds and ends that I collected along the way, mostly other little stems of pumpkin, such as this right here and this right here. And then I also saw some apple peels and some other leftovers from past feedings. And as we excavate the feeding zone, we're going to bump into some other slow composting objects that were placed in here long ago. I mean, when it comes to these pumpkin stems, a good many of them came in with the worms 41 weeks ago, 287 days ago, when we launched this system. And even in the previous location where the worms had lived, these pumpkin stems had already been in service for many, many weeks. So at some point they'll probably begin softening up and becoming such that they'll be able to get crushed. And even when that happens, a lot of times I don't even take the opportunity to crush the pumpkin stems. I just let the natural process occur on its own and let the breakdown process happen without my help. So this is kind of like this little nub end of this gourd over here. This is also just the remains of a gourd, but I can never manage to shake out the contents of this piece right here. I'm seeing a little bit of leftover bedding material that probably came in with the last feeding. This here, I believe, is the gourd that sort of snapped in half when I was just trying to do nothing else besides shake it to try to dislodge some of the material that was adhering to it. So that's part of the reason I'm a little bit more careful with this big gourd here, trying to see if I can not prevent it from breaking, but not be the cause of it breaking. Because if it breaks, that's fine. It's not a big deal, but it is kind of fun to kind of see it remain intact for an extended period of time. But there will eventually come a point where it'll just shatter just from the slightest touch. But for now, it's still holding together pretty good. And oops, I just heard something snap. I think this was the other half of that gourd that broke by me shaking it last time. And it was just a matter of me bumping into it slightly to cause it to crack a little bit. So we've opened up a pretty nice hole here. Oh wow. I typically don't venture too deep down into this system. I try not to disturb the material that's down low, because when the system was launched 287 days ago, it was done so by simply emptying a bunch of in-progress buckets that were housing these worms. But we didn't harvest the castings at that time. The castings that the worms had produced over the 6 months that those worms lived in those yellow buckets came in here along with the worms. And I've been pretty good about not digging down too deep and not disturbing the material down low, because that's down there, that's the material that came over with the worms. And as far as I'm concerned, that stuff is probably nice, clean castings, free of any debris, and I'd like to keep it that way. So I'm not digging down any further. I'm grabbing a nice big hefty handful of bedding material here. This is my prepared bedding, which on this go around is very damp and very highly concentrated in leafy matter. And this overly damp batch is running low now. I'm gonna have to whip up some more prepared bedding. I'm not sure if future batches are going to look quite like this stuff here. But you know what? Before we pile in the new food, I always kind of forget, but I would like to try to get these older objects down underneath the new foods. So let's make sure we take care of doing that before we get ahead of ourselves. Get all these old objects back down into the feeding zone, and then we could pile in today's nice generous assortment of fruits and veggies I mean, I don't know if there's fruits. I know there's veggies from what I could see. I see at least one fruit. This is either a lemon or a lime, and I just can't recall at this point which it is. Maybe a lemon. And here we've got the remainder of the stuff I bought down for them. There was a little bit of racket coming in from the open window. As soon as I noticed that there was a lot of flying insect activity going on over here, I did open the window so that any flying insects would be drawn to the bright lights of the window and then hopefully end up over on the screen and maybe even find their way through the screen or out of the wormery and leave rather than stay here. Look at the size of this carrot. I assume that's a carrot. It looks like it's seen better days. All this stuff is frozen in here, and it is a pretty generous feeding. Before we cover it up though, I'm going to apply a little bit of this pulverized eggshell as grit. And I've been pretty generous with the grit lately. You got to be careful with this dust though. If you're feeding your worms and you've got dust like this flying around, just take care not to breathe this stuff in. I'm pretty sure that the majority of the dust in my pulverized eggshells is not so much eggshell specifically. I think it's probably that really thin inner membrane that is inside the egg. Because I typically clean my crushed eggshells to be free of that stuff to a large degree, but on this batch I did not do that. So this is a very dusty batch of eggshell, much more so than usual. And I'm going to come back in here with my spray bottle to keep going with the Mosquito Dunks solution. And this does also seem like a good opportunity to try leaving a good bit of the material that's been sticking to my glove over here to stay in the worm bin. And I really do hope that this BTI solution works. I'm starting to wonder if covering up the bag could be causing issues here. I mean, I do have the plastic covering on top of the material, resting right here on the surface. I'm wondering if I would reduce the temptation of flying insects wanting to hang out in here by leaving the top open and then just protecting the material inside by bringing back only the top covering plastic. And speaking of top covering, I didn't take a lot of care to not damage these top covering sheets of newspaper that were resting out here on the top surface. So I know that I did tear them a little bit in the process of me removing them. I guess I was a little bit flustered by all the flying insects, so I could have probably taken better care to not tear up these top covering sheets of newspaper, but they do seem to be holding together well enough to go one more round, and then the next time we come in here, chances are that this stuff that we're putting out here as a top covering right now will simply get reused as supplementary bedding down in the feeding zone. So I'm still wondering if I've got the possibility of dislodging some of these larger bits of material off my glove rather than rinsing it off down at the sink. Looks like we've done a pretty good job. And then I think back on can come the top covering that rests out on the surface of the system. But I believe I am going to try not zipping the container shut, and perhaps that in itself will reduce the appeal of this place as being a nice sheltered little hidey hole for the flying insects to remain. In the past, I do remember seeing flying insects getting underneath flaps of fabric here and there in my VermiBag tote, and I don't know where they're finding themselves a place to live here, but I'm going to work on trying to reduce the flying insect situation in here. And man, there are a lot of them over here crawling on this plastic. All right, well, Let's keep our fingers crossed that the BTI does its job. And I guess we'll just have to see as time goes forward. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.